Good evening. Sorry you guys have to follow me after Joey last night. He's up here all confident, like walking around like he's got it all together. And I don't have a podium to hide behind. So speaking of confidence, our lesson tonight is titled From Crushed to Confident. And we're going to kind of have a long prelude before we get into our actual study, which will be actually out of John chapter 21, verses 1 through 17. But before we start, I have a little short story. It says, Charles frequently had bad days. He was rejected often during his youth. He couldn't manage his classes, ultimately failing the 8th grade. When he finally made it to high school and landed his spot on the yearbook staff, they rejected every drawing he submitted. He tried playing golf since other sports held no interest for him, but Charles lost the season's most important match as well as the consolation match that followed. He could have simply given over to his dismay and stopped trying to succeed, but he persevered. He returned to his first love, drawing, despite having had his simple cartoons rejected during high school. He reached out to many publications and studios, including Disney, but he was only in for one more rejection. Everyone continued to turn him down, but that didn't matter. Charles forged ahead. Even a failed marriage proposal didn't stop him. Charles decided to share the failures that had punctuated his own life through his art and sold that idea to United Feature Syndicate in 1950, and Peanuts became nationwide because everyone could relate to the Charlie Brown who never gave up, and neither did his creator, Charles Schulz. So how many of us in our lives kind of feels like Charlie Brown or Charles Schulz? No matter what we strive for, no matter how hard we try to succeed at something, seems like we're always rejected. Maybe whatever we're trying to shoot for always seems to fail. But then we can look at somebody else over here, and it just seems like they've got it all together. Whatever they're striving for, whatever they're hitting, just seems like they've never had any failures. All they have is successes, and it's like they don't have to go through a single hard thing in life. But I'm sure you guys have heard the saying that someone's success is just a pile of failures they're standing on. I'm sure we've heard that in our lifetime. The same holds true with our Christian walk. We can look at somebody in their spiritual life and we think, man, they just got it all together. You know, they can preach, they can teach, their kids are always well behaved. I mean, mine doesn't cry before they go to class at all. But you look at them and you're like, man, how did they get to that point? Or it's like, why can't I be like that? But you don't know what's happened in their past that maybe put them in the place that they're at to where they're like, I'm not going back there, you know. And so we don't know what goes on in people's lives that makes them who they are. Sorry, this is a new and update MyPad from 2024. But you know, people as a whole, we like success. We strive for success no matter what it is. We all have that desire to be successful in something, whether it's in our jobs or in our spiritual walk. It's kind of who we are. And we show our appreciation to those who have attained success. We show honor to them. As Joey mentioned last night, here in about a week, we're going to be celebrating the success of our country becoming free, and that can be in quotations if you want. And so whenever we see success, we want to celebrate it. It's a very natural thing. And in this realm of life, often you don't get a second chance to that success. But fortunately, we serve a God who sees things a bit differently and allows us to have a second chance. And we look at all the individuals that Christ chose to follow him, and I mean, look at who he chose. He chose individuals with past that we probably cannot even imagine, that not all of it's listed in Scripture. You know, he chose people like Saul, murdered Christians, Matthew, tax collectors. We learned last night through Joey's lesson, Zacchaeus was a master or a tax collector, chief tax collector. You look at Moses, he committed murder. David committed adultery. Jacob deceived his own father. Samson lusted after women. Noah, guilty of drunkenness. So all these individuals that Christ chose, they weren't just upright individuals to begin with. So failure, as we know it, it's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. It's something that we're all very familiar with. And at some point in time in our lives, we look back and it could be filled with regret, shame, guilt, disappointment, frustration, and what typically follows all of those feelings. Once we lose, we have shame, we have guilt, we have disappointment, we generally lose confidence in ourselves. And confidence in whatever it is that we're doing. If we're doing our best to follow Christ and, we fall into temptation, we keep failing, then we lose confidence in ourselves, and we're just like, you know what, I'm just not going to try anymore. And that happens all too often in the church. Many Christians in the first centuries and second centuries had to deal with their own failures, their own moments of weakness. One denied Christ. I'm sure it's memories that haunt them for the rest of their lives, and then they tend to question, am I worthy enough to follow Christ? Or will the church ever accept me back? Will Christ accept me back? And I'm sure at some point in time in our lives, we've all felt this sort of feeling, which if we believe that, then we can wrongly believe that there's no room for failure in the life of a true disciple of Christ, and that we're unfit for a leading role in the Lord's church, which we know is completely wrong because we're an imperfect people. And so who we're going to focus on mainly tonight is going to be Peter. And we find with the Apostle Peter, he deals with his own previous failures at perhaps the most important crossroads in his life. He experienced a life-changing encounter with Jesus, and most of us can identify with Peter. He's a very confident individual. He was the first to jump in, not just the water, but everything. He was very overconfident, but he'd be confident in something, he'd do it, but then he'd fail at it. He'd do it, and then he'd fail at it. It's just constantly ups and down, just like a roller coaster. For example, when Jesus called Peter to become his disciple, he had just experienced a failed night of fishing. Luke chapter 5. When he made an effort to walk on water, fear overtook him. He began to sink. Matthew 14. When Peter claimed he would never deny Christ, what did he do? He denied Christ. When Christ told Peter he would flee from him and all the apostles, and he's the first one to pop up and say, all those other guys, they might leave you, but I won't leave you. But what does he do? He leaves him just moments after that. and then goes on to deny him 3 separate times. And one thing I want to point out in his denial, if somebody like Peter, who we all look up to, you would think if he were to deny Christ, it would be to somebody of authority, like Pilate. If Pilate said, hey, you were with him, and he'd be like, no, I wasn't with him, or somebody of authority, but he denied Christ to a servant girl twice, and then to bystanders. And so I just find it interesting, somebody who we look up to so much of the Bible, that he so easily denied Christ just like that to a servant girl and to bystanders. Something just that I would point out. And so after his denial to Christ, back to whenever Christ was being captured in Mark 14, which I've already mentioned, that he said that all these other guys may leave you, but Lord, I'll never leave you. But then we find out just verses later that, he fled and all the other apostles fled. And so then just a few hours later, Peter deserted Jesus with all the rest of the apostles. Verse 50 is where he says, and they all left and he fled. And then, of course, the most famous of his failures was the denial of Christ in Mark 14, 66 through 72. And Mark puts emphasis on Peter that he failed miserably, to where he was just warned hours before that he was going to do that. And so as we've already mentioned, he's an awful large figure to look up to in the Bible with such a large failure in his past. But his failure was different than Judas's. What was his failure? Not that it was any less of a failure, but what was different about Peter's and Judas's mistakes? Exactly, yeah. So Judas, he failed miserably, and Matthew tells us that he showed some remorse, but was never really inclined to repent. And we know what happened to Judas. He hung himself. And what makes Peter such a great disciple is not that his failures were as bad, but he repented, he asked for forgiveness. Immediately after he denied Christ, it says he wept. He knew exactly what he had done right after the rooster crowed, and he denied him. He knew exactly what he had done. So seeing Peter's failures and his denials, it can bring peace to us that Christ is willing to look past what Peter did, and which gives us hope. It's not our failures that disqualifies us as his disciples, but the absence of repentance that does. We can see in the rest of Peter's life that his brokenness and his failures led him to a repentance that would make him to be an even greater servant. I came up with some thoughts after I was almost done, so now I have notes that says go back 3 pages. So my copy and paste broke. So if you see me going backwards, that's why. All right. So after Peter's grim reality of he just spent 3 years walking with Christ on this earth, and then he denied him, how do you think he probably felt at the end of that all of his work was probably for nothing, even though Christ told him, I'm going to die and be resurrected and I'll be with you again? That he probably felt like all the work that he had done was for nothing. He was a complete failure. And what do we tend to do when we fail at something? Like if we try something new, what do we tend to do? Give up? Avoid doing it again. I'd like to think of if I were to quit cutting meat and go do another job, and I fail at that, I'd probably go back to that job because it's like, well, I know I can do it. What's Peter do? And that's where we come along in John chapter 21, verses 1 through 17. And we'll read that real quickly because that's where the rest of our lesson will be. And it says, "After these things, Jesus manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and he manifested himself in this way: Simon Peter and Thomas called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, 'I'm going fishing.' They said to him, 'We'll also come with you.' They went out, got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when the day was now breaking, Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. So Jesus said to them, 'Children, you do not have any fish, do you?' They answered him, 'No.' And he said to them, 'Cast the net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll find a catch.' So they cast, and then they were not able to haul it in because of the great number of fish. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' So when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put his outer garment on, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. And there, that's typical Peter fashion. Acts before he thanks, maybe. And once we read a little bit longer, notice how far out from the beach they were when Peter decided he was going to jump into the water. He threw himself into the sea, but the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards away. To me, that is very far from the land to swim. I would probably make it 100 inches. But dragging the net full of fish. So when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire already laid, and fish placed on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish which you have now caught.' Simon Peter went up, drew the net to land, full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, 'Come and have breakfast.' None of the disciples ventured to question him, 'Who are you?' knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread, gave it to them, and the fish likewise. This is now the 3rd time that Jesus was manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' And he said to him, 'Tend my lambs.' And he said to him again a second time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' And he said to him, 'Shepherd my sheep.' He said to him the 3rd time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was grieved because he said to him the 3rd time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said to him, 'Tend my sheep.'" So, let me flip back here. So we find out what Peter did is he goes back to what he knows best, fishing. And fishing for him wasn't, a weekend getaway. It wasn't I'm just going to clear my head. It was his occupation, his career. And so he goes back to his comfort zone. And yet again, they have another failed night of fishing. So you've got to understand how Peter probably feels in life right now. He just can't catch a break. Which is another, all night of catching nothing. And so there it is again, another failure. And just as when Jesus had originally called them, he's standing on the beach, on the seashore, and he'd already had gathered wood, started a fire, started preparing breakfast when he tells them, "Do you have any food?" And of course, Jesus knew they had been up all night with another failed night of fishing and had nothing. And so when he says, "Cast your net on the other side of the boat," that had to be a memory trigger for them. Like we've heard this before, that you had thought they'd have figured out who it was standing on the seashore. And of course, whenever they caught all the fish that they couldn't manage, then we know that they realized exactly who it was. So we see that Peter dove into the water, swims to shore. Whenever they see Jesus, the breakfast, in Jesus' mind, the breakfast wasn't fully prepared, but yet he already had it cooked, and it says, Jesus said he already had fish. So why did he have any need for their fish? And that's when Jesus says, "Bring some of the fish which you have caught." Why did he do that if he had already cooked fish and had breakfast ready? Why would he request the fish they had caught?
They hadn't pulled the net in yet. They hadn't actually received yet the miracle of all the fish. And there's a secondary miracle there that it mentions that they were able to pull
153
fish in without their nets breaking. So
Right.
he still had more to show them.
Right. Yep. And he didn't really need their fish, because just before then, go ahead, Rebecca.
Well, because he didn't need their fish, I think that too, we're talking about, the replay of an event that had happened before to spark their memory.
Mm-hmm.
I think that may be another one of those moments where he's trying to rekindle a memory again.
Right.
The feeding of the 5,000, so forth and so on. I didn't have to go out and I didn't have to spend all night fishing.
Right.
He kind of saw the reward.
Right.
And I provided all the needs.
Yeah.
One needs. So
Yeah.
It may be that it's another thing to help trigger and help validate their thoughts of who he is.
Right. Yep. And so, like you had mentioned, he didn't really need their fish, because not too long ago he just fed 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So there's an example that he's getting ready to make to these apostles. Go ahead, John.
Well, perhaps it's recalling their memories when they were called to begin.
Right.
He promised that he was going to make them fishers again, and maybe this is their call to action with this example of them bringing.
Right. Yep. And so when he asked them to bring their fish to him, Jesus knew that Peter didn't need another miracle at this point, because he was already at the lowest of lows. He'd already denied Christ 3 times. He fled from him. He just went through another all night of catching no fish. So I think Peter needed to know that he wasn't a failure. And all of us feel the same way when we fail and fail and fail and fail. We need something to boost our spirits, to give our confidence back. And so he needed to know that the fish that he had caught mattered, that his life mattered. So he allowed Peter to provide the fish for the breakfast and the apostles. He kind of treated Peter kind of like a child, how we do our own children to build their confidence up. When we give our children a task, we know we can do it better, faster, way more efficient. Or Em will have the kids cook breakfast sometimes in the morning, and it can be absolutely horrible. You eat pancakes, and you bite in the middle of them, you get egg whites. But she lets them do it, and they're not very good at it. But what it does is it builds their confidence. And so Christ does this with Peter and the apostles as well. He allows them to fail, so that way they can learn from their failures and their confidence will be built. What I like to think of is Bo just started playing basketball and had no clue. I don't even think he knew what a basketball was. And Bradley put together a little team, and so their first game, Bradley's out there placing them all where they should be in the center court, puts Bo where he needs to be, and then the jump ball goes, and all the kids start running back and forth, but Bo stays in that one spot. He doesn't know you're supposed to be running back and forth, and he was confused the whole game. And then he comes right off the court at the end of the game. The first thing he says is, "I like baseball better." But the second game he played, of course we encourage him, be like, "Hey, you didn't know what you were doing, that's just fine." I said, the second game, you'll know you need to hustle. You go from one side of the court to the other. You're going to do a good job. Next game, he made 3 baskets. He comes off the court. He's like, I like basketball. It's pretty good. He got his confidence built up. We're just older children. We need our confidence built back up. Nobody likes to fail. So Jesus pulls Peter aside and presents him with a challenge for his future. And that's where Jesus asks him 3 different times, "Do you love me?" Which we'll go back to that in starting verse 15. He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And that's where he proclaims yes. And then going over to 16, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And then in 17, he asks him again, "Do you love me?" How many times did Peter deny Christ? 3. So how many times does Jesus ask Peter, "Do you love me?" 3. So it's like he is kind of undercover telling Peter, "I'm giving you a chance to proclaim me 3 times, to let him know that, hey, I'm here, we all fail, I know you love me, and this is kind of like your second chance." He sees something in Peter. I found that interesting when reading through it. I'd never noticed it before. So Jesus wanted to establish Peter's priorities. He says, "Peter, am I your first love?" We've already discussed that. So he follows each question, "Do you love me?" and an answer of, "Yes, Lord, I love you," with "Tend to my lambs, shepherd my sheep, and tend to my sheep." And he knew that the old Peter, his self had been broken, and that he was ready to accept the new challenge which Christ was getting ready to put before him of feeding his sheep, which is definitely a life-changing moment for him. There's a fly going ridiculous up here. To equip Peter for this journey and to be fruitful, Jesus provided Peter with the ability to succeed, the confidence to succeed, and the inspiration to succeed. And God gives us all the same type of opportunities. He gives us the ability to succeed. It's not always easy. It's overwhelming. But we can be assured He never leaves us alone. He never left the apostles alone. But it takes a lot of effort on our part. One thing to be a successful leader is you need to realize your strengths, but also your weaknesses. And that can be a hard pill to swallow, is to recognize your weaknesses. And some of those that I think of are, Moses and Aaron. When God asked Moses to take the Israelites out of bondage, and he's like, "I can't speak very well." He realized he couldn't speak very well, so Aaron goes with him. And so It's a very important part of recognizing your weaknesses. I know the apostles had to recognize their own weaknesses to become successful. Does anybody have any comments? Go ahead, Joey.
So, the theme this week, the turnabout point, this is obviously Peter's turnabout.
Right,
Why
you
do
beat
we
me
know
to
this?
it.
Because after this point, we don't see that lack of confidence.
Exactly.
Acts chapter 2, who preaches the first gospel sermon? It's Peter.
Right.
Acts chapter 10, whenever God decides it's time to bring the good news to the Gentiles, who baptizes Cornelius and his family? It's Peter. Acts chapter 11, Peter's called in front of the Jerusalem church, and they're questioning him. Why do you think it was a good idea to baptize this Gentile? And he defends what it is he's done. That confidence, that lack of confidence, it's over.
Exactly. Yep.
Going forward, he is on fire.
Right. Yep, that was literally in my notes next. No, you beat me to it. You say it way better than I can. I bite my tongue off when I'm up here. Go ahead, Dad.
Earlier you was talking about Jesus asked the people, his disciples to bring some of those fish up. And he really didn't need those fish, he already had them. Well, we're no different today as Christians. God don't need us to make his church succeed. He's fixed up the situation so that I can see my failures and that I can grow from them, just as Peter did, and be useful for Christ.
Right.
He doesn't need me to build heaven. It's done.
Right.
He doesn't need me to worship him. He don't need anything.
Right.
But he is gracious enough to give us as humans the way to share eternity.
Right. Exactly.
Through
Yep. Anybody else? Paul?
The examples you gave of Peter's failures, one thing that seemed to also be good for Peter, or that about his personality, was that in every time it was identified for him that he had made a mistake and that he had failed Christ, his pride didn't get in the way of him correcting that. We talked
Right.
about that he repented of those things. In any number of those situations, we could see, even in ourselves, saying, well, I did that for this reason, or why I made that mistake. I was justified because I was trying to do the right thing, or we might make excuses for our
Right.
failures. Instead, we don't see that about Peter, and I think that's a great lesson for us to learn, that if we're going to grow from our mistakes and our failures, we can't let pride get in the way of that.
Exactly.
Stop us from seeing what we could do right, what we could do better.
Right.
And then the other thing is, I think we sometimes confuse confidence and pride.
Exactly. Yeah.
And they're very different.
Exactly. Yep. 5 minutes. Okay. Marty?
Well, there's 3.
Oh, okay.
I never had this thought until tonight we drove this, and I tried to go back and kind of skim over chapter 20 a little bit, but he denied Jesus 3 times, and then I don't think that night he saw Jesus' face, and then he wept, and then I don't think he had much interaction with him the next day. He was crucified.
Right.
And then, the next 3 days, he didn't have any interaction with him. I think there was some interaction with Thomas. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
But I think I saw some of that. He may have witnessed, probably was present when Thomas put his hand in his side. But I don't know how much interaction Peter and Jesus had right after that. And then this is the next interaction he had.
Right.
So I'm sure Peter had beat himself down.
Oh, yeah.
And just eat up with guilt and disappointment
Yeah.
in himself. And then after this episode and this, he needed to be reassured.
Yeah.
He needed Jesus' reassurance that I'm still on your side, Peter.
Exactly.
I'm still with you. Let's go.
Yep. What's interesting about that, I didn't write it down, but I think in Mark, whenever Jesus resurrected, and the angel came and told the 3 that opened the tomb, and Jesus wasn't there, he said, "Go and tell the apostles or the disciples and Peter. He made that distinction. Peter would have fell into the description of the disciples, but he singled Peter out. So Christ knew Peter needs to be reassured that he's not a failure. So I found that interesting as well. But yeah, Rebecca, did you have a comment?
You know, Joey said he's on fire, and Peter he goes on to do really great things. But it's really important to note, too, that Peter still has failures.
Exactly.
At that point.
Yeah.
And think about Paul stating that he withstood him to his face because he was playing the hypocrite.
Yeah.
And, you know, with the Jews and the Gentiles. And so, but he didn't go back to fishing.
Right. Yeah.
Still continued the task that the Lord set. He could have at that point. That would be pretty embarrassing to be called out on something like that.
Right.
He could have thrown in his hat and said,
Mhm.
you know, I'm just not cut out for this. But he didn't.
You're right.
He kept pushing forward. And that's really what Christianity is all about. It's still pushing forward, even when we mess up, even when we feel humiliated.
Right.
When we don't feel like doing it anymore.
Yeah.
Is still getting up and moving forward because He commanded us to do.
Yep. Yep. It's kind of like we're sure to hit whatever we focus on. So if you're driving your car and it starts going out of control and you're trying to keep in control of it and there's a brick wall in front of you and you're just focused on the wall, you're going to hit the brick wall. It's the same with our Christian walk. You know, if our car is going out of control, figuratively speaking, in our life, and Christ is over here, but He's not the center, we're not focused on Him, we're going to miss Him. But, you know, we can be fishtailing a little bit, no pun intended, with what we're studying. But, like we do in life, but if Christ is at the center, we'll still hit Him. You know, He's, like we discussed last night, if we're looking for Him, He'll find us, and we'll find Him. Go ahead, Chad.
And I don't know if it was mentioned, but also our failures help others.
Exactly.
Our brothers and sisters to our left and right. You think of times when folks go forward at the church and the strength it builds to understand that I might go forward and I failed at something.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't help it. But it strengthens our brothers to our left and right and say, hey, I might have failed at something too, but I was too scared to go forward in church
Right.
and ask for prayers. But it can build each other up, our brothers and sisters up, with our failures.
Exactly.
You know, just learning that lesson and asking. I say this all the time, and I say it in our prayers at home, that, you know, please guide me and direct me through this week, because I know I'm going to have failures.
Right.
This week.
Yep.
And I ask that please let me grow off those failures, so I'm not doing that again.
Yep.
And, you know, and again, let's our brothers and sisters go to our left and right. No matter how perfect we think we are, we fell a lot.
Right. Yep. Yep. Anybody else? I think we got, well, it's 7:30, so we can conclude there. But that's basically the gist of it. Peter's turnabout point was where Joey had mentioned that instance on the beach when Jesus showed him, you know, feed my lambs. And so it's when he turned around, he got on fire, and his focus was Christ from there on out. And, I mean, Christ told him, Peter, upon this rock I'll build my church. He's one of the leaders that we look up to still today, and still looking at all of his failures. So it's a reassurance to us, you know, we can still be leaders, no matter where we've been at in our lives. So, thank you guys.